This is another event in our public lecture series called Severo Institute Academic Forum. My name is Josef Šíma, as many of you know. I'm president of this small family-sized private college that specializes on social sciences. And as a part of signaling quality to the rest of the world, a couple of years ago we started this public lecture series, and as some of you know, we had actually outstanding speakers, such as Richard Epstein of the University of Chicago. We had David Friedman of Santa Clara University. A couple of months ago, we had Professor David Schmitz from University of Arizona. We had Bjorn Lomborg, chairman of the Copenhagen Consensus Project. We had Peter Klein of University of Missouri. And today it is my great pleasure to welcome here Professor Gerard Casey, who is a professor in the School of Philosophy at the University College Dublin. Professor Casey was head of Department of Philosophy from 2000 to 2006. He previously taught at the University of Notre Dame and at the School of Philosophy in the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. He received his master and PhD degree from the University of Notre Dame. He has a Bachelor of Laws from the University of London and a Master of Laws LLM from University College Dublin. He serves as on the editorial boards of Geopolitics, History and International Relations, Contemporary Readings in Law and Social Justice, Journal of Self-Governance and Management Economics. And he is also a member of the Royal Institute of Philosophy, the Association for Political Theory, the American Philosophical Association, the Independent Institute, and the Aristotelian Society. He has written extensively on many topics. He recently published a great book on my favorite author, Murray Rothbard, volume 15 in the series Major Conservative and Libertarian Thinkers, published in 2010. And he also published recently a book called Libertarian Anarchy Against the State, published in July 2012. Not only we share our admiration for Murray Rothbard, we are together with Professor Casey associated scholars at the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, and we both sit on the editorial board of a journal called Libertarian Papers. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Professor Gerard Casey.
Thank you very much, Professor Šíma. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's not my first time in Prague, and I hope it's not my last. I just want to say how glad I am to receive the invitation and to be here in this absolutely wonderful space on this wonderful day when, for the first time in about 6 months, I've actually felt warm. Okay, it's great. It's great to be alive. The paper I'm going to give, the lecture I'm going to give today is included in a shortened version in my book, Libertarian Anarchy Against the State. This is the subtle title because I really want to surprise people so they don't know what they're getting. But you're going to get the slightly longer version today. And the good news is, for me anyway, is that the Murray Rothbard book, which came out in hardback a couple of years ago, which meant that nobody, unless you were an incredible plutocrat, could afford to buy it, okay, is actually going to be available in paperback in August of this year. So at least you won't have to mortgage your wife, children, or house in order to buy this. Okay, so... So what I'd like to talk about today is the notion of representation. And so this is a formal lecture, but I'm very happy to take questions and have a discussion with you. In fact, I look forward to that. That's always I know from many years when I was a student, when it was against my principles to go to lectures, and that the most entertaining part of the lecture was very often the question and answer session afterwards. I have to admit I wasn't as bad as one of my fellow students who would never go to the lecture, arrive about 2 minutes before it finished, sit up at the front, and then be the first to put his hand up to ask the question. I thought I was a little bit cheeky, but all right. So first of all, a couple of quotations. Mark Twain once said, "It could probably be shown by facts and figures that there is no distinctly Native American criminal class except Congress." And from that brilliant treatise on political philosophy called The Godfather, okay, this quotation put into the mouth of Michael Corleone, who said, "I don't trust society to protect us. I have no intention of placing my fate in the hands of men whose only qualification is that they manage to con a block of people to vote for them." Okay. There's a lot of good stuff in that book, actually. All right. Tom Hanks and Passepartout are the only two human inhabitants of a Pacific island. Neither is aware of the existence of the other until one fateful day they meet. What happens next is a matter of some moment. Will they greet each other politely and go about their respective businesses? Will they agree to cooperate for their mutual benefit? Will they fight? Who can tell? However, we can be reasonably sure in supposing that if Hanks were to command Passepartout to tote that barge and lift that bale, as in the words of Old Man River, or demand that Passepartout give up his vile habit of drinking coconut juice while eating fish, or insist that Passepartout cooperate with him in his fishing and hunting ventures, or abstain from servile work on a Sunday. In short, if Hanks were in any way to attempt to require Passepartout to obey his commands, Passepartout would, I believe, rightly resent and probably resist such injunctions. The same, of course, applies if roles were to be reversed and Passepartout were to assume the position of would-be commander. Now, the Hanks-Passepartout scenario can be replicated in any number of literary variations, limited only by the fertility of one's imagination. For example, more people might be added to the island's population, and while this would result in there being more possible relationships, it wouldn't change the nature of those relationships. And the essential principles regarding the legitimacy of command can be established by reflections on this insular drama. And so I'm given to you in this way. First of all, changing the characters now, Adam may legitimately command Benjamin to refrain from any action C, if and only if C is a demonstrable initiation of aggression against the person or property of Adam or against the person or property of another innocent human being. If Benjamin refuses to refrain from action C, then Adam may use proportionate force to restrain or punish him. Adam may legitimately command Benjamin to perform action C if and only if C is an element of a freely, that is, non-coercively, arrived at binding agreement between Adam and Benjamin, and C does not violate condition 1. In other words, it doesn't involve coercion or violence. If Adam refuses to perform action C, then if Benjamin, I'm getting confused here. If Benjamin refuses to perform action C, then Adam may use proportionate force to elicit compensation or indeed specific performance. Finally, in no other case may Adam legitimately command Benjamin either to refrain from an action or to perform an action. And if he were to do so, then Benjamin may refuse to comply with such a command and, where appropriate, may resist that command with proportionate force. To put the matter simply, two human beings in the world, not otherwise related and without prior agreement, no one has a right to command another positively to do anything and negatively to refrain from doing things only if those things, if you like, involve aggression against oneself or against an innocent other, and you have to be careful about third parties. All right. Now, what is true of the one is true of the many, and so that if no one person has a right so to command me, no two persons acting severally or in concert have that right. They may, of course, combine to use their superior force to coerce me into doing what they require, but that's a matter of might, not right. And whether the number purporting to command me be 1, or 2, or 7, 1,223, or 10 million, it cannot, except under the conditions I've just sketched, be a matter of right. In the end, numbers don't make a difference. So then let us consider the situation confronting us all in our daily lives. In every modern state, some group of people, usually a fairly small group of people, purport to have the authority to command the mass of the population to do this or that, or to refrain from doing this or that. They don't possess such a right by virtue of some special divine gift, still less by virtue of their manifestly superior intelligences or moral virtues, since that experience shows us that our erstwhile leaders, by and large, are no better in general than the rest of us and are often, sadly, much worse. By what right, then, do they claim the authority to command us, to make laws for us that govern many, if not most, of the significant aspects of our lives? Government, then, as a systematic exercise of such command is usually called, requires a justification. Now, this isn't to raise the much more fundamental anarchic question of whether governance is at all justified. In the context of this talk, I'm going to leave that to one side. I'm going to ask merely why some group of people are entitled to command others to do things or to refrain from doing things. Now, in the not-so-distant past, those who claimed the right to govern others did so because they claimed, a mandate from God, rather like the Blues Brothers, but with a sort of wider remit, extending beyond the boundaries of Cook County. Or were better than the common run of man by virtue of their outstanding intellects, sterling characters, Nietzschean will, or distinguished family tree. Or had more money than the peasantry, or were simply more powerful than other people. Now, whatever persuasive character such justifications may have had in the past, they have very little, almost none now. Divine rule theories of government are at an all-time low ebb, though in fact there's much more to be said for them than you would think, but leave that to one side. They're at a low ebb in the intellectual market. Aristocratic theories of government command no respect, oligarchic theories even less, and might is right theories are now, as they have always been, absolutely bankrupt. In the arena of government justification, democracy is the only game in town. Or if there's a fundamental article of faith in the contemporary world, it's not that God is dead or that soccer is the beautiful game. Okay? It is rather that democracy is a good thing. Capitals, democracy is a good thing. So widespread, so accepted is this belief that to call it into question is to invite bafflement, bewilderment, and bemusement. And when it becomes apparent that one is not joking, dismay, disbelief, and derision. I know this from personal experience. The key to the justification and popular acceptance of democracy is the idea of representation. Those who are governed are thought to be governed by those who represent them, and thus it is claimed, in being governed by those who represent them, they are, in effect, governing themselves. This gets over the problem of why, in any political structure, some rule and others are ruled. Because if rulers and ruled are, in effect, one and the same, then the problem of one person or group of people arbitrarily commanding another disappears. The justification of political governance then rests upon democracy, and the justification of democracy, in turn, rests upon representation. Now, if then representation, or indirect democracy, because that's what we're talking about here, the last remaining contender for the justification of political governance, finds itself in no more tenable position than any of its competitors, then it's going to be very difficult, in fact, to justify governance of any kind. Now, despite the central importance of the concept of representation, not a huge amount of work appears to have been done on it. The classic work in this area is a book by Hannah Pitkin called The Concept of Representation, now over 40 years old. She supports my claim regarding the linkage of democracy and representation, noting, quote, the contemporary popularity of the concept of representation depends much upon its having become linked with the idea of democracy. Although, as she points out correctly, initially neither the concept nor the institutions to which it was applied were linked with elections or democracy. In the questions and answer afterwards, we might want to move into this particular area because there are quite a number of notions of representation, but for good or for ill, historically, the notion of representation has become more or less ineluctably linked with that of democracy. The contingent connection of democracy with representation is now of historical or academic interest only. For the contemporary mind, democracy and representation are so interlinked as almost to be conceptually indistinguishable. Given this contemporary firm linkage between democracy and representation, a problem in political philosophy is how best to conceive of political representation. Is a political representative an agent of those whom he represents, limited to the carrying out of their instructions, or is he a trustee, free to act in the interests of those whom he represents according to his own best judgments of what those interests are? Or is he neither an agent nor a trustee, being simply able to do more or less what he likes once elected? Or are there other possibilities in addition to those? Pitkin's book is an extended analysis of the various options. I believe that the idea of political representation derives such rhetorical force as it has from a set of loose analogies with non-problematic, ordinary instances of representation, some of which I'm going to sketch. That none of the ordinary instances of representation translate without loss into the political realm, and that ultimately there is no coherent idea of political representation that can survive rational scrutiny. So let's consider whether there are any restraints on representation. One could envisage a man standing up at a shareholders' meeting and saying, I represent the small investor and I believe that the entire board of directors should be removed. Or in a university saying, I represent the administrative staff of the university and we want parity of treatment with the academic staff. Now, one may question whether or not such alleged representatives are in fact representative, but their claim to be representatives of their constituency seems to be, in principle, comprehensible, even if it turns out to be false. However, what would we make of a man standing up to say, I represent myself, and I believe the entire board of directors should be removed? I represent myself. Okay. It would, I suggest, seem a trifle odd. Of course, one can imagine that in circumstances where it is customary or conventional for one to be represented by another, for example, as a defendant in a legal trial, one might answer the question, who represents you, by saying, I am representing myself, my lord. Meaning by that, of course, that this is to be understood as this saying, really, no one else is representing me, rather than the sort of strange metaphysical concept of my representing myself. But leaving aside strange and bizarre cases like this, representing yourself doesn't make any sense. Now, ruling out then the relevance of self-representation, let's test our intuitions by examining some ordinary instances of representation. So, I'm unable to go to a meeting of the committee of my local residents' association. It's an important meeting where decisions of some importance are going to be made, so I ask my wife to go along in attendance, subject to the consent of the meeting. I inform her of my views on the important matters under discussion, and when it comes up, she puts those views forward as being mine. In those circumstances, she represents me. An issue comes up for decision in the higher echelons of the university. A discussion takes place at the meeting of the Department of Philosophy, and a general consensus emerges. The head of department is mandated to make the department's collective view known to the powers that be, and in these circumstances, the head of department represents the department. I want to buy something at an auction, but I do not want to appear there myself for fear of raising the price. I hire a destitute but needy graduate student and to purchase the painting for me. I give him explicit instructions on the price. He does exactly what I have commissioned him to do. He represents me for this specific transaction. I grant power of attorney to my lawyers with general but not completely elastic instructions. As long as they remain within the remit of those instructions, they represent me. All of these are ordinary, everyday cases of representation. Johnson is my local member of Parliament. I did not vote for him. I do not agree with any of his views. Does he represent me? Robinson is my local member of Parliament. I did vote for him, not because I actively desired his election, but because I wanted to prevent the election of an even more disagreeable candidate. As it happens, I agree with some, but not all of his views. Does he represent me at all times, or only when his actions conform to my views? So we come to the question then, in what way are our political representatives representative? What does it mean for one man to represent another? Well, under normal circumstances, as the examples show, those who represent us do so at our bidding and cease to do so at our bidding. They act on our instructions within the boundaries of a certain remit, and we are responsible for what they do as our agents. Furthermore, the central characteristic of representation by agency is that the agent is responsible to his principal and is bound to act in the principal's interest. This, of course, as everybody knows who studied business, doesn't always happen, and we have the classic agent-principal problem. How do you get your agent actually to act in your interest and not simply in his? But leave that to one side. In fact, but political representatives are not usually legally answerable to those whom they allegedly represent. In fact, in modern democratic states, the majority of a representative's putative principles are in fact unknown to him. He's never met them. He's never seen them. Can a political representative be an agent of a multitude? Well, this seems unlikely. What if the principles have interests that diverge from each other? A political representative must then of necessity cease to represent one or more of his principles. That's assuming, by the way, that he's representing any. He cannot represent them all. The best that can be done in these circumstances is for the politician to serve the many and betray the few, excuse me. At least I didn't spill the water, which is something. Okay, where are we? Okay. All right. Now, Pitkin notes, a political representative, at least the typical member of an elected legislature, has a constituency rather than a single principle. And that raises problems about whether such an unorganized group can even have an interest for him to pursue, let alone to will to which he could be responsive, or an opinion before which he could attempt to justify what he's done. The political representative has a constituency. He is chosen by a great number of people, and am I on the right page? Yes. And while it may be difficult to determine the wishes or interests of a single individual, it is infinitely more difficult to do so for a constituency of thousands. I hope you're admiring my skill here in keeping these papers from falling off. On many issues, a constituency may not have any interest, or its members may have several. This is Pitkin. Now, in Pitkin's view, these passages establish the difficulty of representing a constituency. However, I think she understates the problem. It's not that it's difficult to represent a constituency, it's practically impossible. Right? It's not something you could do if only you had more energy and more time. It's something that cannot be done. And by the way, I'm not accusing political representatives of ill intent or incompetence or all of the other things which I'm sure many of them are guilty of. Even somebody trying to do his job as best he can and full of energy and zeal would not be able to represent simply because it cannot be done. There is no interest common to the constituency as a whole, or if there is, it is so rare as to be practically non-existent. That being the case, there's nothing to represent. I should obviously make the point that in extraordinary circumstances, it is theoretically possible that you could, say, in a constituency with 80,000 constituents, have a meeting of minds of all 80,000. In other words, as to whether or not they wanted an open cast a nuclear dump in the middle of their residence. Probably you would get everybody to say no in those circumstances. Though my guess is you'd probably find one crank who thought it was a good idea. But in those are probably the only circumstances in which you could get everybody to agree. And that, you will, I think, agree with me, is not the norm. Anyway, now some may take issue with the notion of representation presented here and argue we're dealing with a considerably more complex phenomenon, that political representation is just one instance of a whole variety of representation, that representation can be symbolic, formal, religious, or iconic. Firstly, while my remarks apply primarily to representation as agency, similar considerations can be brought to bear in making appropriate changes to representation as trustee, as deputy, or as commissioner, and so on. Once again, as with our Desert Island drama, the basic conceptual point can be grasped from the single example of representation as agency. There's little to be gained except a sort of soothing tedium from a rehearsal of the inapplicability of the other paradigmatic types to political representation. And secondly, one could agree that there are current a variety of notions of representation. I had mentioned symbolic, formal, religious, and iconic. Full treatment, of course, of the subject would require a discussion of all of these and other types of representation, but of course I don't have time, nor do you, to go into all of them. I just want to make in passing, by the way, I can't resist this because this annoys people and I like annoying people. I'm going to talk a little bit about iconic representation. In iconic representation, A is said to represent B if A is like B in some respect. So a woman, simply by virtue of being a woman, represents other women. A person of a particular skin color, simply by virtue of that fact, represents other people with the same skin color. But of course, there's a logical problem here, which is that everything is like everything else, in some respect or other. And so it comes about that on this notion of representation, if you take it seriously, anything or anybody represents any other thing or anybody else. And of course, that makes the whole notion of representation completely vacuous. So what sense can be made of claims sometimes made that some groups, say, for example, women, are, quote unquote, underrepresented in particular professions? In most contexts, of course, there's simply no representation going on at all. Suppose that I, a man, am employed in a particular capacity in a particular firm. Just by virtue of being a man, I do not represent men. By the same token, I don't represent fathers, philosophers, the middle-aged, the cranky, or any other group. I'm not representing anybody. I've just got a job, right? These are not appropriate arenas for representation, and so there can be no underrepresentation simply because there can be no representation. Oddly enough, one rarely hears complaints of groups being underrepresented in such non-glamorous occupations as, have I got the right page, refuse collection or sewage works. I never hear anybody actually demanding to be represented in these areas. It's kind of odd. Anyway, other kinds of representation, religious, symbolic, and so on, may well play a role in human discourse, and I'm not ruling them out, and I'm not undermining them and so on, but this sheds no particular light on the central problem we are presently concerned with, which is that of political representation. I cannot imagine anyone being satisfied with an account of political representation that ultimately reduces it to the symbolic, the religious, or the iconic. Now, it is, of course, perfectly possible that the concept of representation is systematically ambiguous and that there is at best a sort of family resemblance between its various kinds. If this were so, it would leave the notion of political representation as a more or less distant cousin of other kinds of representation, so that, as in the case of human relations, while John resembles Howard and Howard resembles Tim and Tim resembles Michael, it doesn't follow that John resembles Michael in any way. So A can resemble B and B, C and so on, but when you get to the ends, the resemblance runs out. So it's not a transitive relationship. However, Pitkin, again, adopts a working assumption that representation does have an identifiable meaning, applied in different but controlled and discoverable ways in different contexts. It's not, she says, vague and shifting, but a single, highly complex concept that hasn't changed much in its basic meaning since the 17th century. Her attempt at a definition is as follows. I really shouldn't pick on Pitkin, but hey, she's the only one around, right? Representation, she says, taken generally means the making present, in some sense, of something which is nevertheless not present literally or in fact. Well, it's hard to deny that. But then it doesn't really throw much light on our problem either. Okay. This is immediately followed by another attempt at definition that may not be the same. Who can tell? In representation, something not literally present is considered as present in a non-literal sense. Now, she admits that these simple definitions may or may not be particularly helpful, and in fact, I find it hard to disagree with her own negative judgment on her own definitions. However, having exhaustively examined the various instances of unproblematic representation, this is Pitkin again, agent, trustee, deputy commissioner, and so on, she concludes, quote, none of the analogies of acting for others on the individual level seems satisfactory for explaining the relationship between a political representative and his constituents. These are her words. He is neither agent, that is, the political representative, is neither agent, nor trustee, nor deputy, nor commissioner. He acts for a group of people without a single interest, most of whom seem incapable of forming an explicit will on political questions. Houston, we have a problem, right? Okay. It is difficult to see how this point could be made more clearly. Thank you, Hannah. Great work. Terrific. One would think that such a state of conceptual confusion would lead one to give up on any idea of discovering a coherent account of political representation, but Pitkin plows on. Must we then, she says, abandon the idea of political representation in its most common sense of acting for? This possibility, she says, has sometimes been suggested. Perhaps representation in politics is only a fiction, a myth forming part of the folklore of our society. Or perhaps representation must be redefined to fit our politics. Perhaps we must simply accept the fact that what we've been calling representative government is in reality just party competition for office. One is tempted to say, yes, yes. Alas, Pitkin says, no, no. She thinks it is perhaps, again, a mistake to approach political representation too directly from the various individual representation analogies, agent, trustee, and deputy. She then proceeds to suggest a kind of institutional or systemic account. Political representation, she says, is primarily a public, institutionalized arrangement involving many people and groups and operating in the complex ways of large-scale social arrangements. What makes it representation is not any single action by any one participant, but the overall structure and functioning of the system, the patterns emerging from the multiple activities of people. This sounds like desperation to me. This makes no sense at all. Okay? So, it is representation, according to Pitkin, if a people or a constituency are present in governmental action, even though they do not literally act for themselves. She says, she picks it up again when she says, when we speak of political representation, we're almost always speaking of individuals acting in an institutionalized representative system. That's true. And against the background of that system as a whole, that their action constitutes representation if they do. But of course, the basic question of what representation is supposed to be escapes through the holes in this particular net. Frankly, to put the matter in the most scholarly and sane way, this is nonsense. And ultimately, it's a counsel of despair. It comes to this. This is what she's saying. None of the paradigmatic uses of the term representation, as instanced by the various examples she considers, suffices to make sense of the idea of political representation. Most people would give up at this stage, not Pitkin. So she invents a whole new, unsubstantiated, systemic account. Instead of individuals representing, we instead have a system that represents. We are to forget we've been unable to make any sense of individual political representation. We can kick the problem upstairs by ignoring the individual and having the system itself be representative. There's only one small problem with this account. What does it mean? Okay. Let us risk committing the fallacy of composition and assert that if the idea of explicating political representation by means of the analysis of individual acts of agency, trusteeship, and so on is unrealizable, the problem is hardly solved by simply positing the system as a super agent of representation. This is a particularly unhelpful and obfuscatory account, one that has no basis in our everyday experience of representation and which is amusingly reminiscent of the postulation of normative power by the doctor in Moliere's Le Malade Imaginaire to explain the soporific qualities of opium. This is to explain the obscure by the more obscure. It is also a striking example of what the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. If it is to be tenable, representative then or indirect democracy requires a clear, robust and defensible conception of representation. No such conception has been forthcoming, and it's doubtful if any ever will be forthcoming. It used to be said that only three things were definitely true of the Holy Roman Empire: that it wasn't holy, that it wasn't Roman, and that it wasn't an empire. Okay? Similarly, two things are definitely true of representative democracy. It isn't democracy, and it isn't representative. Apart from that, it's just fine. In the end, representation is a fig leaf that is insufficient to cover the naked and brutal fact that even in our sophisticated modern states, however elegant the rhetoric and however persuasive the propaganda, some rule and others are ruled. The only question, as Humpty Dumpty said in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, the only question is, which is to be master? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sticking to time schedule. We now have room for questions, comments, suggestions. The mic is available, so don't be afraid to ask. And indeed, your questions or comments can be only vaguely related to what has been said. As you all had a chance to see, Professor Casey is a man of many interests in philosophy, but also outside philosophy, so feel free to use his presence to ask or comment. There is one question.
When you gave example with Adam and Bill, or what their names, whatever, two guys met on an island, and you said that it doesn't matter how many are there in the island because the outcome should be by moral virtue always the same. You cannot command, you cannot steal, and you cannot destroy my pizza by more salami that I don't want to. But anyway, maybe there is like limitation with the transaction cost of establishing some human relations. So from that, the government arouse because like you have some barrier at N people or Y people, I don't know how many, that at now the government arouse because there is too costly to make transactions about the relations with everyone.
Okay, all right. If I understand you correctly, your question has to do with the possible limits involved in human relationships consequent upon transaction costs. Yeah. So, yes. What you say is indeed correct. There are transaction costs. So clearly, it makes no sense for me if I'm living in Dublin to fly to Prague to buy a litre of milk and fly back again, right? Just doesn't make any sense, right? And indeed, there are all sorts of ways in which economic systems are constrained by transaction costs. However, none of that seems particularly applicable to the point I was making about the legitimacy of command. In other words, what we have... Margaret Thatcher just died shortly, and she was notorious for having said, there is no society. Actually, what she did when you actually look at the passage from which this is taken, she said, there is no society, there are only individuals, and those individuals have to take care of themselves, each other, and their communities. So what she was saying, there was no abstract entity called society which did it. In the end, it is human beings that act, right? Not some kind of system. So the point then is that society or our economic system, complicated as it is when you look at it from the outside, is in essence simply a complex arrangement of bilateral relationships. It's always A and B. Now, the A and B can be themselves complex and involve relationships, but in the end, I'm dealing with you, he's dealing with you, you're dealing with him, and you're dealing with me, and so on. So it's very hard to keep track of all those relationships. But nonetheless, it's simply bilateral. When I make a contract with somebody, I don't make a contract with 27 individuals. In law, at least in the common law tradition, there's a doctrine called privity of contract. And that is that only those people who are parties to the contract can benefit or bear the burdens of a contract. Now, there are a few small exceptions to that, but generally speaking, if you're not involved in the agreement, then you cannot expect to benefit from it, except incidentally, nor can you be asked to bear the burden. And of course, part of what we see in politics all the time is that people who have in no sensible way actually agreed to contractual or semi-contractual arrangements end up bearing burdens. In Ireland, for example, we had a spectacular instance of the collapse of our national finances in 2007, 2008. And our government, in what can only be described as a fit of insanity, signed a blank check for our banks committing to support them almost without limit. Now, when they said they committed to support them, what they meant was, I'm going to get the bill for this, right? And my sons and my friends and all of those. In other words, we're the ones who actually end up paying for it. Now, they say, of course, we're the government and we represent you. And I'm saying, hang on a second, I don't remember this being, I don't remember being an item in your platform when you ran for it. Yes, in the event that the banks are looking, staring down the barrel of a gun, we will commit you to paying 65 billion so that every person in the country will be responsible for about 55,000 euros. Well, thank you very much. Great. So, the point is that, yes, there are issues of transaction costs in various dealings, but they don't, I think, unless I've missed something, maybe the point you wanted to make, they don't apply in the case of the issues of either preventing somebody from acting, okay, which the only reasons you can do that if it's coercive, okay, violently coercive, or requiring somebody to act, and that's only when there's a specific contract or agreement to do so. Outside of that, right? I mean, yes, and society and the economic world gets extraordinarily complex, and that's great. But that's the limiting case.
Oh, good evening.
Wow, I didn't get any of that.
Sorry. My question is about the enforcement of contract fulfillment. If I understand you correctly, you say if I made a contract with another person and that person doesn't fulfill the contract, I am entitled to use the force to force him to fulfill the contract. If you hold that this is a general principle with no exceptions, even, for example, cartel agreement about the price or restriction in production, because the economic theory says that cartel agreements are bad for the consumers, and so we don't enforce the cartel agreement, even if it is obviously agreement by willing parties. If you would say that this is the case when one side will not fulfill the agreement, and other side can force the fulfillment.
I may not have fully understood, I beg your pardon, what your question here. If I understood it was something like this, that is what you were saying, that it's not always a good thing for...
Yes, to enforce the fulfillment of contract.
From the point of view of the contracting parties or the people around?
Well, from the point of one contracting party and all people around.
Okay. It's clearly the case, of course, that if you and I form a contract and I perform my part of the contract and you haven't, I have the right to insist on either you're compensating me for your non-performance or, and I owe this to breakfast conversation with Walter Block, I believe that you should, in a libertarian society, be entitled to insist on specific performance. Whether or not it would be wise to do so or not is another question. I'll give you an example in a moment. But of course, that's a right. You don't always have to exercise your rights. I don't have to insist on your performing. I can forgive you. I can simply ignore it. I could decide, for example, it's not worth it. I could decide that you're such a dubious character that the amount of time, to come back to the first question here, the amount of time and effort, the transaction costs would be so high in trying to get compensation that it's not worth it. And we very often do that, right? So the controversial point about this principle, which usually gets up people's noses in a big way, has to do with specific performance. And it's this. In most legal systems, let's say I contract with you that I will pay you so much and you will paint my house. Okay? So I pay you, you spend the money, and now you refuse to paint my house. Well, in the common law system, all I can do is I can sue you for damages. And if the court finds in my favor, you will be required to pay me some money. Of course, we have no money. It's pointless, right? But what courts are very reluctant to do is to insist on your actually painting my house. So again, let me change the example. Suppose I'm an impresario and I arrange with a singer to come and sing. And I've advertised and spent money and rented the venue, and suddenly she says, I don't want to come and sing. Now, again, in contract law, normally what I'm entitled to do is to sue her for non-appearance and for, costs and all of the rest and so on. But I think in a libertarian society, you should have the right, if you chose to do it, to actually force her to come and sing. Now, needless to say, of course, in those circumstances, my guess is she would sing very badly. Okay? And it probably wouldn't be a good idea. But, and you would probably know this in advance and probably would not want to insist on specific performance, right? Knowing how human beings are. And indeed, if you were my would-be painter and you were the kind of person who wouldn't keep a contract, I would be rather dubious about letting you paint my house anyway. But those are prudential decisions. They don't take away from the basic legal fact in a libertarian society that I should, if I chose, and if I perform my part of a contract, be entitled, if I wished to do so, to insist on either the payment of compensation, adequate compensation as determined by some neutral third party, or indeed specific performance if I chose to go down that route. Yep.
My question was about specific about cartel agreement. Cartel agreement. Cartel. Yes, you contract with another firm that you will restrict your output, or you will not sell under a specific price.
Oh, okay. I didn't get that. Yeah. All right. So what's the word again? Where you form, what's the word? Cartel. Thank you. Sorry, this is very outside Alzheimer's. I'm sorry, just I forget words. Okay, in a cartel agreement, right? I mean, Rothbard has pointed this out consistently. There, in a libertarian society, of course, there's nothing to prevent people agreeing to sell or to set their prices at a particular level if they choose to do so. Whether it's wise to do that or not is another business. Of course, one could argue that all firms are, in a sense, in internal cartels anyway, and so on, and what the specific distinction is another point. But what actually tends to happen, as most economists know, is that if a cartel is initially successful in restricting output and raising prices, the usual bugbears of a monopoly, but this time a monopoly with many members as there were in it, that what tends to happen is that it becomes attractive for one or other of the members of the cartel to undersell because prices are higher than they would be in a free market. They're going to find willing customers if they're willing to undersell their associates. And there are all sorts of ways to do this. It's very hard to keep a cartel together, right? I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying it's really, really hard. And history has shown us that they tend indeed to fragment, often with mutual recriminations, that only to reform again and then deform and break up. But from a libertarian point of view, there's nothing intrinsically problematic about a cartel.
So you say you have the right as the other firm to enforce the cartel agreement?
Well, between the members of the cartel.
Between the members, if one firm decides to undersell all others, and all others will sue and...
Okay. Let me take a step back. Most legal systems, again, will allow contracts to range over almost everything except things that they think are fundamentally illegal or immoral. So I don't know of any legal system which will enforce a contract in the Hollywood sense of that term. In other words, where you have paid somebody to kill somebody else, right? You know that sense of contract? Okay, so you and I have contracted. I've given you a lot of money, and I said, I can't go on living with my wife any longer. Okay, I want you to kill her for me. Here's, I don't know what the going rate is, 25,000 euros or something. And so we've made an agreement. But because the agreement involves, for its execution, I use the term advisedly, okay, aggression against an innocent third party, even in a libertarian society, that contract is unenforceable, right? It cannot. In other words, you cannot make a contract over that matter, right? Because the matter is fundamentally illegal by the basic and very limited laws that operate in a libertarian society. Now, only if something like that pertained to the cartel would it be the case that the contract that you had entered into was actually unenforceable. This is one of the areas, I mean, maybe, because I'm going to be here for a few days, if people are at further conferences, we might want to talk about this a little bit more. One of the debatable or debated issues within libertarian theory is exactly what the constitutive elements of a contract are, right? Whether it is simply as it is in the common law system, an agreement between two parties with consideration. Consideration being, if you like, the doing or the forbearing of something which is to the benefit or of the second party or the detriment of the first party. Or whether there is another way of thinking of that. And therefore, depending on your notion of contract, right? If you have different notions of contract, you may well get a different answer to that particular question. Okay? But that's not the only controversial area in libertarian theory. There are lots of others as well. But anyway, it's a good question. Okay.
These are great issues, and I guess we all feel a sort of conflict there. On the one hand, our attempt to kind of rationally reconstruct the system and look for like the meaning of these concepts, and on the other side we have the existing legal systems, in this case operating in certain cultural background. And my question is, how much do you believe in kind of rational reconstruction or rational construction of the systems, legal systems, system of punishment, and to what extent we have to rely on the culture, generally speaking?
That's a great question, and I'm not saying that just because he's my host. I'm very interested in law. I'm very interested in legal history, in the origin of law. I have a section in the book here which is on that. I'd like to do more. I'm very interested in Roman law, how it came about, and law generally. There is no society where you have no language. Every society, every culture has a language of some kind. It may be spoken only by 50 or 100 people, but they have a language. There is no society where they have no ethical system. It may be different from ours. It may range over different things and in different ways, but an ethical system they will have. For example, every society has a prohibition on the indiscriminate killing of other human beings. Of course, your view of what a human being is may be the people who live in my tribe and not anybody else. But that's a material difference. That's not a formal difference. Okay? And the sad history of mankind has been, if you like, a slow, remorseless, but sometimes backing and filling, if you like, extension of humanity to the whole of the human race. Similarly, there is no society which can exist without law. Law is coeval with society. It's not as if we all get together and we're getting on very happily as a society, and then somebody says, "Oh, here's a good idea, let's have some law." Right? It doesn't happen like that. Societies exist because people are living together in community and organizing their affairs and making decisions and arbitrating disputes and all of that. That's law. It may take a significant amount of time before a particular community will reflectively appropriate what it is that they're doing and start thinking about it and talking about it and so on. But there is no society, there can be no society without law. And all law begins in custom and habit. Roman law begins in custom and habit, and I take Roman law because it's the best legal system it's the best known of the early legal systems. And one of the great shocks I got when I began to study Roman law was that almost all really interesting Roman law is private law. It's not public law. And I was looking for, where's all their criminal law, where's all their sort of public law, and they don't really have it. Right? And so, in Roman society, for example, if you had a dispute with somebody else, who acted as a judge, by the way, in Roman society? Does anybody here know? Who were the judges? Say again? Nope. No, the praetor wasn't the judge, ordinarily. The judge was any other Roman citizen that the two parties could agree on. Or failing that, the first name on a list kept by the praetor. by the major legal official, Praetor, the praetor, okay? And that was it. That's your judge, okay? And that, in fact, is how most societies have functioned. In early medieval Irish society, law was operated by it was private, by families who had, as a matter of fact, learned the customs and the habits and the ways of proceeding of the society. And when people had a dispute, they went to them. It was purely private. Nobody was compelled to go. They had to give a decision that was scrupulously fair. Otherwise, they would go out of business. They had no way of enforcing it. So how did you enforce an agreement? Well, very simply, the parties to the dispute had to pledge sureties or post a bond before they went. And then in the event that they didn't, if you like, pay up, the bond would be forfeit and so on. In criminal cases, what tended to happen in the extreme cases of homicide, what would happen was that the sentence would be, in other words, the judgment would be made, the person would be found guilty of illegal in homicide, and their kin group, their kinship group, which were the people, if you like, backing or supporting them, would say, we're no longer doing that. But without your kinship support, you're an outlaw. And that effectively says that if anybody kills you, nobody will seek revenge or retribution. And so in that circumstances, I know what I would do. I wouldn't hang around the local inn or have a pint. I would simply move out of the jurisdiction, and that's exactly what happened. So you see in legal systems, you see the way in which law emerges through a process of custom and habit. Now, I'm not a functionalist in this sense. I do not think that necessarily everything that a customary society comes up with is a good idea. And customary law, as we know about it in history, is filled with all sorts of anomalies. First of all, it's status-driven. In other words, different people in the communities have different values. They incur different penalties. They pay different prices. You have free and slave. You have male and female. You have young and old. You have rich and poor. And it's status-driven. And, of course, we find that in Roman law as well. And so there are lots of elements that could not be tolerated in a libertarian society. But to make this answer shorter than it otherwise would be, my point is that when we look back at the core of customary law systems, we find that at the heart of every legal system is what is known in legal theory as things that are malum in se, things that are wrong in and of themselves, as distinct from malum prohibita. Malum prohibita are things that are wrong because we had to make a decision about how to do things best, and this is how we did it. So let me give you an example. Killing people indiscriminately is malum in se. Stealing people's property is malum in se. Driving on the other side of the road that other people don't drive on, or whichever way it is malum prohibita. There's nothing intrinsically immoral or illegal about driving on the left or driving on the right. But once traffic gets above a certain speed, you need to make a decision. And once you've made the decision, then everybody needs to drive on that side of the road. What you cannot have is somebody saying, I need some excitement in my life. I think today I will drive on the left. Okay? Right? Even though the matter is indifferent, okay, once a decision has been made in a society to regulate it, then this has to be done. Of course, people who insist on violating that have violated a positive form. But this is simply a particular way in which law is given effect. So to come back to your point then, in the libertarian society, the areas of life that are constituted by malum and se would be the core of law, right? And that's where the non-aggression principle ranges over. Other than that, it would be a simple matter of communities making the arrangements that they wish to make, and communities making arrangements with communities as they saw fit and changing them as they saw fit. And then within that context, those who had agreed to them would be bound by them, and those would be the positive ways in which we would have to get on with our lives.
Good evening. Can I ask you, do you think that ostracization is powerful enough to enforce people to fulfill their contracts? Or do you need some state to enforce contracts, or some police departments? Excuse me?
Would you mind just repeating that? I missed the start of what you said.
Whether ostracization, I mean to reject, to do not cooperate with uncooperative parties, is powerful in us to enforce people to fulfill their contracts.
Oh, to ostracize.
Ostracize. Sorry for my pronunciation.
Yeah. No, that's fine. I beg your pardon. Well, effectively, what happens in customary law societies, because they have no prisons, right? They don't have any place where you put wrongdoers. So the way in which you deal with persistent malefactors who are seriously damaging the community by killing or stealing or assaulting or raping or whatever it is they're doing is you effectively kick them out of the community. In other words, you withdraw privileges from them. Now, you might think this is a sort of crazy and a bad idea, but think about it. Again, I maybe seem to be obsessed with Rome, but there are so many good examples. In Roman, when occasionally you had a dictator or a number of dictators in Rome, for example, the first triumvirate or the second triumvirate, one of the things they often did was draw up a list of prescription. And they would say, we are going to kill all of these people. And your name was on the list. Now, generally, there wasn't much of a secret about this. In other words, you would find out very quickly that your name is on the list. And of course, the sensible thing to do is to get the first boat away from Rome. And then, of course, they would seize your property. It's interesting, for example, that in the second triumvirate of Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, I can't remember who the third party was, nobody can, that the only one, I think, who was actually killed was Cicero. And that was at the insistence of Mark Antony, because Mark Antony was so annoyed by the horrible things that Cicero had said about him in the Senate. Everybody else, they just seized their property. So in customary societies, again, your ability to participate in the society is to some extent a function of your being embedded in a kinship group. Okay? If you have no kinship group, you effectively have, in modern terms, no insurance. If you have no insurance or no bond, nobody's going to deal with you, or at least people are going to deal with you as a very high-risk interactor, right? And so, by and large, you're going to find it in your own interest. If you're not physically ejected from the society, okay, you're going to find it in your interest actually to move. And that's how so you have similar things. You have the process of ostracism in Greece, where if you were too brilliant, too smart, too wealthy, you were regarded as constituting a danger to the polis, okay, and so they would kick you out of society. Or you could be on a prescription list in Rome, or you could simply become an outlaw in a customary Germanic or Anglo-Saxon or Irish society, and you would have the protection of your kinship group withdrawn from you, and therefore you would have to take yourself elsewhere. Interestingly, by the way, one of the things that Irish kings were forbidden from doing, even the highest ranking person in a society, was to offer shelter to an outlaw from another region. Right? The king could do many things, right? But that was one thing that even the king couldn't do. Right? So there was this kind of cooperative arrangement. So once you were expelled from your own society, you became effectively a non-person. There are great advantages in this. One, B, you were still alive. Two, nobody had to kill you. And B, nobody had to pay for the jail, which is even better.
All right, thank you very much. I guess it's time to end this formal part of our today's meeting, which indeed means we can continue debating about the limits and key ideas of libertarian society. Informally, I hope some of you will join us and we'll go somewhere outside and have a couple of beers, because that makes the debate more fluent and interesting. Thank you, Gerard, for being with us. Thank you, audience, for showing up. As you already know, there will be a couple of more events with Professor Casey. There is his public, or not public, but his talk tomorrow in the morning at the University of Economics. Then on Thursday, after lunch here at Severo Institute, and Thursday evening, a sort of farewell seminar on the toughest questions ever debated. So you have the schedule on the school website, or go to the Facebook site, and you are welcome to join us during the whole week. And I hope also because of you, Professor Casey will greatly enjoy the whole week in Prague, and hopefully he'll come again, and hopefully he will come with his students, and so that we will have a chance to meet libertarians from Ireland, and we will have an opportunity to socialize with them as well. So thank you again. Have a nice evening, and come again to Cevro Institute. Thank you.